Hi all, this is Upasana from Edureka, and in this session we are going to learn all about Scrum. So before I begin, let me discuss the agenda for today. We're going to start out by discussing a little bit about Scrum. This is where I introduce you to what Scrum is, a little bit about the framework. We're going to discuss why we do not follow the waterfall method anymore, followed by which we are going to talk about Scrum Framework, the basic elements of Scrum Framework, what it is built upon, empiricism, and the life cycle of Scrum. Then we're going to discuss what is a sprint, the various elements. Then we're going to discuss Scrum Ceremonies, wherein we are going to talk about a sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. And then I'm going to conclude the session. All right? Also, kindly take up this time to go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an update from the Edureka YouTube channel. So without wasting any further time, let's get started. So what is Scrum? Now to understand the importance of Scrum, let's look at how Scrum compares to the older alternative, which is the waterfall development. The waterfall model consists of a long time which is involved in planning. Then again, by long time, I mean a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. Then it might take about the same amount of time to build the product, say a couple of months more. Then testing, followed by reviewing, and then finally deploying the product. At this point, you might end up bringing the wrong product according to the market demands to the market. Because when you started out with planning this product, it was almost a year ago. And now the market demand might have changed. Now I'm sure a lot of you might already have guessed what the problem is with such a model. Firstly, the entire plan should be complete before you start building or testing your product. Now obviously, if you're doing this in one whole iteration, it means that most of the planning is being done without understanding the project or the difficulties that you might face while building the project, the drawbacks, the loopholes, and most times after you start building the project, it is sent back to the planning phase again, which brings you back to your square one, in which case your project has to start over or the developers are just criticized for not understanding the plan properly. This process can be repeated many a times, which consumes a lot of time, followed by the product getting thrown over the fence to test, where, in case you encounter problems, the project is thrown back to the building process or sometimes again back to the planning process. And the same thing can happen over the next few steps, including a lot of backstepping and doing over. This can lead to lag times and many months or several years in order to get a product out the door. Scrum solves this problem by breaking the project into smaller parts. First, you start out with just enough planning to get the project started. Next, you build the project with the minimum amount of features, which is like your base features. And then you test for the same and review for the same. And once this cycle is complete, you have in your hands a potentially shippable product. Now this process takes around 2 to 4 weeks and it is repeated time and time again, reducing the time taken for the cycle of planning to testing to reviewing a certain product. This way you end up with several different versions or several different incremental releases, each taking lesser time than the previous or just about the same time. And by the time you have 5 iterations of these, you already have 5 vividly improved versions of the same product, each keeping up with the market development that's going on outside of your company. And this is called Scrum. So Scrum is a framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. Now you need to understand 3 things about Scrum. Firstly, Scrum is lightweight. Second, it is simple to understand. And third, it is very difficult to master. Scrum itself is a simple framework for effective team collaboration based on Agile. And it is the opposite of a big collection of interwoven mandatory components which are a part of the previously discussed waterfall alternative. Now, Scrum promotes developing products through processes, techniques, and practices with various iterations and increments to deliver maximum value, as I had mentioned before. So that way, the first cycle of your planning, building, testing, reviewing shall be called your first iteration. The second one will be your second iteration. The third time you plan, build, test, and review will be your third iteration, followed by the fourth, and finally the fifth. Now, these iterations are called sprints. And at the end of each sprint, you have the launch of a potentially deliverable software. Each software version much better than the previous one. Each sprint takes up about 1 to 4 weeks, and you keep repeating these sprints until your product is feature complete. Sometimes you might even end up shipping your product after just the second sprint. But sometimes it may also take 3, 4, or 5, or even more sprints. But at the end of it, you have a good product, and that is what matters. Now, Scrum follows an agile approach to tackle complex problems. Now, agile is not a methodology or framework or a process. Now, agile promotes self-learning and self-organization as opposed to a lot of planning and a big collection of interwoven mandatory components. It implements a scientific method which replaces a programmed algorithmic approach with a more heuristic one, with respect for people and self-organization to deal with the unpredictability of complex problems. This approach basically means not planning the whole entire process to create a potentially shippable product, but to only plan enough to start out with and then react to the responses that you get with each sprint or each iteration. Now, there are 3 roles in Scrum. First of all, you have the person with the bright ideas who is the product owner. Next, you have the Scrum Master, who is the one basically implementing Agile and preparing the team to follow the Agile approach and making them more efficient. And finally, you have the team. Mostly, the team consists of developers, testers, writers. It can be anything. Each of them can be replaceable by either one of them. So on certain days, you might find that developers are testing, testers are writing, so on and so forth. The main objective here is to create the product in the best possible way. There are a lot of reversible roles that are being played in the team. Now, to make you understand the approach of the Scrum Master or the Agile approach, let me take a problem statement. So take, for example, there are a number of people in the room, and they have to queue up according to their respective heights, taking as less time as possible. So there are these many people in the room. Now, to this problem, there can be 2 solutions. First of all, we have the supervisor approach. Here, we have a traditional supervisor or a manager, and basically what they do is they arrange people one by one, taking up the time for each person to align themselves, which basically takes up a lot of time. And also, as a team, you learn nothing about organization. But then you have what you call the Agile approach. Here, let's bring about the same number of people, and we have a Scrum Master. Now, what the Scrum Master does is he allows the team to organize themselves, and in the end, he brings about whatever changes he deems necessary. And that, my friends, is the Agile approach. Now, the Agile approach, which is mostly used for software development, is an approach under which requirements and solutions evolve through the collaborative effort of self-organizing and cross-functional teams. So basically, people here are self-organizing, which consumes less time under the continuous guidance of their Scrum Master. So what it is that it's a set of practices that promotes continuous iteration of development and testing throughout the development cycle of the project. As I had mentioned before, it promotes self-organizations and assists teams in responding to the unpredictability of the problem in hand. And the person that promotes such an approach is called the Scrum Master. He or she is a person which allows the team to self-organize and manages the process for how information is exchanged. Now, There are a few anti-patterns when it comes to the Scrum Master. First, the Scrum Master is not a supervisor. Now, this problem is quite common with people that are usually old project managers. Being a Scrum Master is completely a different role than a project manager, and therefore the way the individuals act must be completely different. Typical project managers tend to organize the work of the people instead of allowing them to self-organize. They tend to say how, by whom, and by when the work must be done, not giving the team much space to think on their own. The result of this is basically a team full of robots instead of people who have the mind to think on their own. A Scrum Master must be aware of his behavior to be able to correct it. It's not easy. Usually these people have worked for several years in a typical project management position, and simply deleting this behavior will take up some time. But being aware is the first step. Let people grow, let people have their own breathing space, and do not try to be a supervisor. It is not a control situation here. Second, the Scrum Master is not just a secretary. Now, many people think this way. In such a situation, I get extremely worried because it means that people do not know what a Scrum Master should do. When people think the Scrum Master is just a guy booking meetings, felicitating dailies, and serving coffee to their colleagues, this is where things get very dark. And unfortunately, this is very common. The Scrum Master has dozens of different roles and hats, but this is way far away from the secretary job that most companies associate Scrum Masters with. Scrum Masters teach, recruit, and coach people to grow into true leaders and work cohesively as a team. And finally, self-organization does not mean the absence of management. Like I had mentioned before, a Scrum Master is there to constantly monitor the growth of the team. Letting a team self-organize does not mean that there is nobody to supervise them. With that, let's move on to the Scrum Framework. Now, Scrum is a simple, lightweight framework. It is not a methodology. Scrum implements the scientific method of empiricism, which replaces a programmed algorithmic approach with a more heuristic or a self-learning one. With respect for people and self-organization to deal with unpredictability and solving complex problems. As you can see in the graphic in front of you, it starts with the inputs from stakeholders and then the product owner with the bright ideas, all the way till the finished products, which is then reviewed in the sprint retrospective. Now, most of you might wonder what empiricism is. Now, empiricism basically means you're working in a fact-based, experience-based, and evidence-based manner. Scrum implements an empirical process where progress is based on observations of reality and not fictitious plans. Scrum also places great emphasis on the mindset and cultural shift to achieve business and organizational agility. So basically, there are three pillars to empiricism. First of all, you have transparency. Now, this means that you are presenting facts as is. All people involved, the customer, the CEO, the individual contributors, are transparent in their day-to-day dealings with others. They all trust each other and they have the courage to keep each other abreast of good news as well as bad news. Everyone strives and collectively collaborates for the common organizational objective, and no one has any hidden agenda. The next pillar of empiricism is inspection. Now, inspection in this context is not an inspection by the inspector or auditor or supervisor, but it is an inspection by everyone on the Scrum team. The inspection can be done for the product processes, the people's aspects, practices, and continuous improvements. For example, the team openly and transparently shows the product at the end of each sprint to the customer in order to gather value feedback. If the customer changes the requirements during inspection, the team does not complain, but rather adapts by using this as an opportunity to collaborate with the customer to clarify the requirements and test out the new hypotheses. And finally, as I had just mentioned, adaptation is the third and final pillar of empiricism. Adaptation is the context which is about continuous improvement. the ability to adapt based on results of the inspection. Everyone in the organization must ask this question regularly. Are we better off than yesterday? For profit-based organizations, the value is represented in terms of profit. The adaptation should eventually relay back to one of the reasons for adapting Agile. For example, faster time to the market, increased return on investment through value-based delivery, reduced total cost of ownership through enhanced software quality, and improved customer and employee satisfaction. So these were the three pillars of empiricism. Now let's go ahead and look at the Scrum life cycle. Now this slide is a graphical representation of an agile project using Scrum. Starting on the extreme left, you can see the product owner owning the backlog and developing user stories with the team or requirements for the project or the product. The product backlog is prioritized with the higher priority items on the top of the backlog. The team with the product owner then decides to group the user stories into releases based on the product roadmap. Once the release plans have been completed, the user stories are then selected for a sprint. The sprint can be from 2 to 4 weeks or sometimes 1 to 3 weeks. The team then disaggregates each user story into tasks. And then in each sprint, the product is developed. And as the code is written, it is integrated into the system. And daily scrums are held. At the end of a sprint, there is a sprint review where the working software is demonstrated and presented. Then it is presented to the customer for acceptance. The team then conducts a sprint retrospective to ask themselves the question, what could be done better? The stats on the team are then updated, as are the information radiators, which transparently displays the status of the team, which again make their way back to the user stories, and then the whole cycle begins again. Next, let's discuss what is a sprint. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, sprint is basically an iteration of planning, building, testing, and reviewing. A sprint has consistent durations throughout the development phase, and this is mostly between 2 to 4 weeks. It cannot be more than 4 weeks long. As described in the Scrum Guide, a sprint is an iteration, as I had mentioned before. It has a time box of 2 to 4 weeks, during which a product is done, usable, or potentially releasable. And by product, I mean an increment of a product, like a version of a product. Now, sprints have consistent durations, which are usually limited to 1 calendar month. Now, during the sprint, no changes are made that would endanger the sprint goal. The quality of goals do not decrease, and the scope may have to be clarified. Now, each sprint may be considered a project with no more than a month's horizon, in which you have to accomplish something. Each sprint has its own goal, a design, and a flexible plan that would guide in building it with the resultant product increment. Now, the thing with a sprint is, if the sprint's time box is too long, then the definition of what is being built may change, complexities may arise, and the risks may increase. Hence, sprints enable predictability by ensuring inspection and adaptation of the progress towards a sprint goal at least every calendar month. Now, there are a few factors which affect the duration of the sprint. First of all, the stability of backlog. Now, obviously, if backlogs keep increasing, that may push the date of the sprint. And secondly, you have overhead costs. Now, sprints also limit risk to 1 calendar month of cost. If the cost increases, then it may affect the duration of a sprint. Now, overhead costs. Now, each sprint is going to have a sprint meeting, the testing phase, a review, and a retrospective. Now, these are overhead costs. Now, if the overhead costs can be reduced by planning and automation, integration, etc., these costs can be absorbed. Now, by reducing these costs, overhead costs, you can reduce the duration of the sprint. Now, it is the Scrum Master's job to make sure that the development of the product goes according to the sprint planning. Now, there are a few other sprint terminology which I want to make you aware of. First of all, you have your sprint goal. Now, as the name suggests, what you want to achieve at the end of the sprint, your product with the feature sets that you have decided with your product owner and your customer is your sprint goal. Then you have your sprint cancellation. Now, once the sprint duration has been determined and the user stories are selected, neither the duration of the sprint nor any user story can be altered. However, a sprint cancellation occurs if there is a significant change in priorities or mid-course correction in between a sprint. Considering we are only talking about 2 to 4 weeks of work, the cancellation of a sprint is highly unlikely to occur. Next, let's discuss the Scrum artifacts. Now, Scrum has 3 artifacts: product backlog, sprint backlog, and product increment. Firstly, you have product backlog. Now, product backlog, as it is described in the Scrum guide, is an ordered list of everything that is known to be needed in a product. It is the single source of requirements for any changes to be made in the product, and the owner is responsible for the product backlog, including its content, availability, and ordering. Now, a product backlog is never complete. The earliest development of it lays out the initial known and best understood requirements. The product backlog evolves as the product and the environment in which you're going to use it evolve continuously. It is dynamic and constantly changes to identify what the product needs to be appropriate. It is competitive and useful. If a product exists, the product backlog also exists. Now, product backlog refinement is the act of adding detail, estimates, and order to items in the backlog. This is an ongoing process in which the product owner and the development team collaborate on the details of the product backlog items. During this product backlog refinement, items are reviewed and revised. Multiple Scrum teams often work together on the same product. One product backlog is used to describe the upcoming work on this particular product. Next, you have something known as a sprint backlog. Now, the sprint backlog is a set of product backlog items that are selected for the sprint, plus a plan for delivering the product increment and realizing the sprint goal. The sprint backlog is a forecast by the development team about what functionality will be in the next increment and the work needed to deliver the functionality into a complete increment. Now, the sprint backlog makes visible all the work that the development team identifies as necessary to meet the sprint goal. To ensure continuous improvement, it includes at least one high priority process improvement identified in the previous retrospective meeting. The sprint backlog is a plan with enough detail that changes in progress can be understood in the daily Scrum. The development team modifies the sprint backlog throughout the sprint. Only the development team can change its sprint backlog during a sprint. The sprint backlog is a highly visible, real-time picture of the work that the development team plans to accomplish during a sprint. Next, you have the increment. Now, the increment is the sum of all product backlog items completed during a sprint and the value of the increments of all previous sprints. At the end of a sprint, the new increment must be done. And done in Scrum has a different meaning. Done in Scrum or Agile basically means that the product must be in a usable condition and meet the Scrum team's definition of done. Now, you might think your product is done, but if that differs from my definition of done, and we both are in the same Scrum team, then your product is not considered done. An increment is a body of inspectable done work that supports empiricism at the end of the sprint. Now, the increment is a step towards a vision or a goal. and it must be in usable condition regardless whether the product owner decides or not to release it. With that, let's move on to the ceremonies or events in Scrum. Now, Scrum has 4 ceremonies. First, you have sprint planning, then you have the daily Scrum, then you have sprint review, and finally, you have sprint retrospective. Now, I'm going to touch up on each of these one by one. First, you have sprint planning. Now, sprint planning is basically the plan of work to be performed during the sprint. It is time-boxed to a maximum of 8 hours for 1 month or 2 hours a week. For shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter, and the Scrum Master ensures that the event takes place and attendants understand its purpose. The Scrum Master teaches the Scrum team to keep it within the time box. Now, sprint planning answers 3 major questions. First, what can be delivered in the increment resulting from the upcoming sprint? This basically discusses the advanced feature set that you are going to deliver in your upcoming version of your product. Next, how will the work needed to deliver the increment be achieved? This is where you plan what you do in the week and the week next to it. It is the Scrum Master that teaches the Scrum team to keep their work within the time box. And 3, when is your work considered done? As we discussed, the definition of done is very important to the entire Scrum team. Everybody has to agree upon a checklist on completing which your work should be considered as done. Next, we have the daily Scrum. Now, the daily Scrum is an internal meeting for the development team. It is a 15-minute time-boxed event to synchronize your activities and create a plan for the next 24 hours. It is held every day of the sprint, and the development team plans work for today and tomorrow. This optimizes team collaboration and performance by inspecting the work since the last daily Scrum and forecasting upcoming sprint work. The daily Scrum is held at the same time and place each day to reduce complexity and answers fundamentally 3 questions. What did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And what are my impediments? By impediments, I mean challenges and requirements that you have while completing your work. It is very important that your Scrum Master know the challenges that you're facing and why you couldn't complete your work yesterday or why it might be difficult to complete your work today. The Scrum Master ensures that the development team has the meeting, but the development team is responsible for conducting the daily Scrum. The Scrum Master teaches the team to keep the daily Scrum within the 15-minute time box, and he or she also ensures that if there are others present, they do not disrupt the meeting. Next, we have the sprint review. Now, sprint review is an event to inspect the increment and adapt the product backlog if needed. There could have been a single deployment or many deployments during a sprint which lead up to that increment to be inspected. During a review, the Scrum team and the stakeholders collaborate about what was done in the sprint, and based on that, any changes to the product backlog during the sprint. Attendees collaborate on the next things that could be done to optimize the value, and this comes in the form of an informal meeting and not a status meeting. The presentation of the increment is intended to elicit feedback and foster collaboration. It is time-boxed at 1 hour a week, and the sprint review includes, first, the product owner explaining what product backlog items have been done and what has not, and 2, the development team demonstrating the work that it has done. And finally, the entire group collaborates on what to do next. This is at most a 4-hour meeting for 1-month sprints, and for shorter sprints, as I mentioned, it is 1 hour a week. Finally, the aim here is so that a sprint review provides valuable input to subsequent sprint planning. The review of how the marketplace or the potential use of the product might have changed will obviously affect what is the most valuable thing to do next, and review of the timeline, budget, potential capabilities, and marketplace and competition for the next anticipated releases of the functionality and capability of the product is also discussed. The result of the sprint review is a revised product backlog that defines the probable product backlog items for the next sprint. Now, this backlog may also be adjusted overall to meet new opportunities. Finally, you have the sprint retrospective. Now, this is basically an opportunity for the Scrum team to inspect itself and create a plan for improvements to be enacted during the next sprint. This occurs after the sprint review process and prior to the next sprint planning. This is almost a 3-hour meeting for 1-month sprints, and it is time-boxed at 45 minutes a week. This is an opportunity for the Scrum team to improve, and all members should be in attendance. Now, each team member has to answer 3 questions. Firstly, what went well? This basically helps you tell your Scrum Master what went well in your previous sprint, and those practices should be enforced in your coming sprints as well. Next, what didn't work well? What were the impedances, difficulties, and requirements which weren't fulfilled in the previous sprint? And finally, what should be done differently? Here, you introduce the changes that you want in your working process or in terms of software that you're using. And these are the differences that you need to commit to improve in the next sprint. The Scrum Master encourages the Scrum team to improve its development process and practices to make it more effective and enjoyable in the next sprint. During each sprint retrospective, the Scrum team plans ways to increase product quality by improving work processes or adapting to the definition of done, if appropriate or not, in conflict with the product or organizational standards. By the end of the retrospective, the Scrum team should have identified improvements that it will implement in the next sprint, and implementing these improvements in the next sprint is the adaptation to the inspection of the Scrum team itself. Although improvements may be implemented at any time, the sprint retrospective provides a formal opportunity to focus on inspection and adaptation. With that, we've come to the end of all the Scrum ceremonies that I had to discuss. Finally, let me conclude the session. So far we've covered what is Scrum, and in that we have discussed why don't we use the waterfall model, what is Scrum, what is Agile, and who is a Scrum Master. In our next topic, Scrum Framework, we discussed what is Scrum Framework, what is empiricism and 3 pillars that support it, and what is the life cycle of Scrum. In the third module, we discussed what is a sprint, what factors affect the sprint, and what are sprint artifacts. Finally, we discussed Scrum Ceremonies, where we discussed sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and what is the sprint retrospective. Now, it is very important to understand that Scrum works not because it has 3 roles, 4 events, and 3 artifacts, but because it adheres to the underlying agile principles of iterative, value-based, and incremental delivery. It frequently gathers customer review and embraces change. This results in faster time to market, better delivery, more predictability, and increased customer responsiveness. The ability to change by managing changing priorities enhances software quality and improves risk management. And that is the reason that Scrum works. With that, I'm closing my session. Thank you and have a great day.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!